Hello and welcome to the In Publishing podcast. Our guest this week is Christopher Phin, Head of Podcasts at Dundee-based publisher DC Thomson Media. I talked to Chris about the diverse podcast portfolio he oversees, ranging from sport and politics to gardening and social history, why he believes podcasting is the most intimate medium, which turns dull activities great, and his top tips for launching a successful podcast as an extension of your brand.
It is an incredibly intimate medium. It is, I would argue, the most intimate medium. My voice is coming from the center of your skull, and there's literally no way to get closer to somebody than through an audio podcast.
Chris revealed some of the key insights from DC Thomson's podcasting strategy, how it enables them to build deeper relationships with existing audiences.
Podcasting is an incredibly sticky medium, so we can deepen these relationships with our audiences and clasp them more tightly to our bosom.
How it can help to find new audiences.
We can find new audiences. Podcasting traditionally skews a little bit younger than most media, so we can onboard new audiences into our brands.
That it enables journalists to become more than just bylines.
Allowing them to sort of step out from behind the keyboard a little bit and build a more trusting and open and informal and passionate and the kind of conversation you have in the pub.
And last but not least, the importance of making money with podcasts.
You've got to make money. We need podcasts to be not just fluffy little marketing vehicles for our brands, putting a good chunk of change into the bottom line.
We would like to thank our podcast sponsor, Acorn Web Offset, the Yorkshire-based specialist A5 and A4 magazine printer. With high-speed web offset and sheet-fed printing, together with in-house saddle stitching, perfect binding and mailing services, Acorn can cope with the most demanding of production turnarounds. Acorn prides itself on its efficiency and low-cost print production. For more information, visit acornweb.co.uk. Chris Phin is head of podcasts at Dundee-based publisher DC Thomson, where his portfolio includes Scottish politics podcast The Stooshy, the Dirt Gardening podcast from Grow Your Own magazine, Pass It On, a podcast sharing retro household tips from the 1950s, and no fewer than 3 separate podcasts covering Scottish football. Chris, welcome to the In Publishing podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me on, Ciar. It's such an honour.
Well, you're very welcome. And can we begin by talking about your journey in publishing to where you are now and what got you into podcasting?
Well, there's never really been a plan. I think that's an important thing to say, especially if people listening to this might be earlier in their career. And it's always quite, I found when I was younger, and I'm 40 now, when I was younger, I found it quite intimidating hearing people talk about their careers, and it always seems so planned and conscious. But for me, there never really was. I spent most of my career in magazine publishing. I worked first with Dennis Publishing in London and then with Future Publishing in Bath. And I left there in a huff. And I left as an editor-in-chief of a group of titles focusing on, it was all tech titles that I was working with or in charge of. And I did a little bit of freelance for a while, a bit of consultancy. Which I was quite enjoying, actually. I hadn't really expected to enjoy it, but then DC Thomson came and asked me if I would interview for a position here in Dundee, and my daughter at the time was about 6 months old, and we had been thinking about moving from Bath, where we were, back to Scotland to be a bit nearer our families, and so all those things kind of worked out. There were some internal changes with the magazines that I was working with, and I did a few different things in the company for a little bit. But then we'd been talking a little bit internally about creating a podcast strategy for DC Thomson Media. And I, for the first time in my career, really, whatever age I was, 39, went, please let me do this. I want to do this. I think we could do something really interesting, exciting and valuable here. And I'd like to be the one who did it. But I mean, I've been listening to podcasts and radio for a long, long time. I remember being a university student Well, actually, I think one of my earliest radio memories was Diana. I really remember because I used to come back from my waitering job and I'd put Radio 4 on. I was a very, very square teenager. I put Radio 4 on or the World Service and listened to that. And one of my earliest memories of something important was the death of Diana. But I've been listening to radio, whether it was Talk Sport. Weirdly, I don't like sport, but I used to listen to James Whale and Talk Sport and a whole bunch of stuff. And then into radio, DAB actually, while I was commuting on a bus, and then into podcasts. And they've always been a really important point of coalescence for passions about stuff. And I've really always responded to that.
Well, you clearly have a passion for podcasting. So what do you think is the appeal of podcasting in particular?
Well, I'll give you two answers. One from the point of view of the punter, and one from the point of view of the publisher. And for the punter, it's really for me that there's tons and tons of stuff, but the really key thing is that it turns dull activities great. When you leave your house in the morning, when in those days when we used to do such a thing, when you leave the house in the morning, dreading your hour on the tube crushed up against somebody's armpit, or you've got to do you got to work out and you don't enjoy working out, or you've got the dishes to do, hoovering to do, whatever it is, suddenly those things become not the dull thing that is precipitating that period of time in your life, but they become, oh great, now I can listen to, right? There's a new episode of, can't wait to catch up on. I was halfway through and I want to see how it ends. So the fact that these turns these dull activities great, that really matters, I think. And then from the other side of the fence, from the publisher side of the fence, it's that it is an incredibly intimate medium. It is, I would argue, the most intimate medium. If you're listening to this, to me talk right now on headphones, as most people do when they're consuming podcasts, that's changing a little bit now, but most people still listen on headphones. My voice is coming from the center of your skull, and there's literally no way to get closer to somebody than through an audio podcast. And that intimacy is brilliant for brand building and relationship building with the audience, but it's also great for delivering a highly engaged audience, whether that's for internal marketing reasons or internal editorial reasons, or whether you want to deliver an audience that is valuable for advertisers. So the fact that they turn these dull activities great, and the fact that it's an incredibly intimate medium, I think, are two of podcasting's greatest strengths.
Well, I don't know if there is a formula for the perfect podcast, but could you tell us, in your opinion, what are the common characteristics of a good podcast?
I think any good podcast is one that serves, and one that is respectful of its audience, right? Podcasting very often operates in very tight niches. Not always, but there are a million podcasts out there, more than that, and generally speaking, they tend to hyperserve small niche audiences very well. And you've got to be respectful of your audience, and that means, for one thing, delivering valuable content for sure, but delivering in a way that is engaging for them and useful for them. And I don't mean useful in a sort of, it doesn't have to be a deeply practical thing, right? It could just be that it feeds their passions, their peccadillos, whatever it is that has brought them to you. So the content has to be relevant to them. The personalities have to be relevant for them, and actually the editing needs to be decent as well, and the capture needs to be decent. So it's definitely true that you could start a podcast today with nothing but your smartphone, and you could produce something that was 70% great. But making some decisions about formats and structures, getting some decent kit in place, and doing a half decent job on the editing to make this thing slick, so it's not flabby. All these things are good characteristics of podcasts.
And regularity is important as well, isn't it?
It seems to be still, yeah. I mean, I was talking to a producer at the BBC recently who was talking about the fact that, there is this perception in podcasting that you can drop the podcast whenever you like because people will listen at odd times. And that is definitely true. We've only been doing this for a year and a half, but if I look back to our very first episodes that we published, people are still listening to those. And those are of podcasts that in theory are very time-based. It's not evergreen stuff that you would think would be consumed at any point. It's, weekly news-based stuff, but people are still listening to them. So it's definitely true that people do listen, out of sequence and out of cycle. But the point is definitely true still that people do like to have their podcast episodes drop at a particular time, to know that this episode comes out on a Thursday afternoon, and therefore at any point from Thursday afternoon until like the Monday or Tuesday, depending on when I can find a window of half an hour to listen to it, it will be there for me, right? Now I think that may begin to change a little bit. We're still, especially people of our age here, we still come from a tradition of broadcast media where the BBC One showed a thing at a time, and so on.
Yes,
And
yeah.
so I think we've still kind of got that mindset, but I suspect that will begin to change more and more as the influence of, and I'm always very wary of people with grey hair, as I have, pontificating on Snapchat and TikTok and that sort of stuff. But as the kind of meta characteristics of those tools more and more inform media shapes, and that's more and more how generations coming into media are consuming, and therefore will start to produce media. I think we'll begin to more and more break down that sort of regular pulse of something coming out at a particular time. But I will say that from the other side of the desk again, having a regular schedule is it's one thing less to think about.
Yeah.
It makes the deliverability of your podcast that bit more. So never shy away from it, I don't think, at least not for the next 5-10 years.
Oh, that's interesting to hear. So, coming on to your podcast portfolio at DC Thomson, can you give us a brief overview of the different podcasts that you are responsible for?
Absolutely. So you mentioned a few of them in the introduction. There are 10 currently, with some more in development, one that's imminent, in fact. I can't tell you anything about that yet, but it'll be super exciting
Okay.
when we finally release that. But we have, as you mentioned, The Dirt, which is our gardening and allotment podcast out of Grow Your Own. So, and you will detect no pattern in these podcasts, because DC Thomson Media's portfolio is so broad, particularly with the acquisition of PSP Media and Aceville in the last couple of years. So it's a very, very broad portfolio. So The Dirt, which is our gardening allotment podcast, The Stushy, our Scottish politics podcast you mentioned. We have 3 football podcasts. Indeed, 2 of those are covering the 2 Dundee teams. So we've got The Courier talking football and Twa Teams One Street, both of which cover Dundee FC and Dundee United. And then Northern Goal, which comes out of the Aberdeen Journal's offices in Aberdeen. So that's Aberdeen FC, Ross County, Cove Rangers, the Highland League. We've got Bunkered as well out of PSP that covers golf. Pass It On, you mentioned, as a sort of social history podcast. And then there's a couple of business ones. We've got Energy Voice Out Loud, that is targeted at the energy industry, oil, gas, and renewables. And the Global Franchise Podcast, which serves the franchise community across the world. And then the last one to mention is Author in Your Classroom, which is a podcast in which we virtually bring authors such as the Children's Laureate, Dara Breen, Dermot O'Leary, Connie Huck. We bring a lot of authors into the classroom to talk about their work to the students. And that's associated to plazoom.com, which is our education resource site. And there's an education pack goes along with each of those episodes, so that you can listen to the episodes. It's broken into 3 sections. Second section always includes the author reading their work. And then there's a pack of activities that the teacher can then just give the kids to do from that. So it is an incredibly broad portfolio. But one thing you will, the only sort of common thread in there is that they are almost all very niche subjects. And I think, if you'd said to me, Chris, will you go away and launch 2 football podcasts, both about Dundee and Dundee United, I might have raised an eyebrow at you. But that kind of came out of the fact that, we have 2 newspapers here in Dundee. We've got a daily and an evening newspaper, and they both have very different voices, and they both talk about local issues in very different ways. But they both have a very strong sports section. And so, serving those communities that will be ignored by the mainstream media broadcast apparatus is great. And in fact, we had one of our journalists on the BBC Scotland sport podcast, Off the Ball. Sorry, I called it a podcast, radio programme recently. And the presenter there, who is a local lad, was talking about the fact that it is great that we've got organisations like ours that will hyperserve their local community. Because I think there's a huge appetite for this stuff, even if the numbers of people who might engage with it are comparatively small.
So, as you say, a very diverse portfolio, but you did mention that you came into this role looking at a podcast strategy. So can you tell us more about what that strategy and what your objectives are?
Yes. So there are four main, there were and remain four main planks to the reasons we would do this, the podcast strategy, if you like. The first one is to enable us to build deeper relationships with our audiences, because podcasting is an incredibly sticky medium. We get multiple times the engagement rates with our podcasts than we would get for their analogous brand expressions in print or online or in any other format. So it's an incredibly sticky medium. So we can deepen these relationships with our audiences and clasp them more tightly to our bosom. We can find new audiences. Podcasting traditionally skews a little bit younger than most media that publishing companies of DC Thomson Media's stature will traditionally operate in. So we can onboard new audiences into our brands. We can, sort of analogous to the first point, really, we can make our journalists be more than just bylines. We can really expose them as 360-degree, full, rich people with. This is always a trick. I've never worked out a good way to articulate this, right? So bear with me as we think this through in real time. I want, especially our news journalists, when they're on their podcasts, to allow themselves not to be completely objective. Now, there's a risk inherent in that, right? You understand there's a risk inherent in that our audiences might start to think. Take our football podcast, for example. If we have for decades been accused of bias in favour of Dundee FC and Dundee United in the same breath by different people, it's just part of the gig, right? You'll always be accused of bias by one side or the other, and the fact that you're accused of bias by both is always a good sign. But anyway, if you're accused of that bias, if then one person on that panel allows themselves to be seen as supporting one or other of those teams, then there's a risk to the reputation for objectivity that you have as a newspaper journalist. So it's an incredibly difficult balance to strike, and yet it is a really valuable thing to do. And I think part of that is because I maintain, still moving into a post-brand era where more and more people are responding to people and to personalities rather than they are to brands. And so allowing, Graham Finnan and Callum Woodger and George Cran and Sean Hamilton and Eric Nicholson and Jim Smith, allowing these people who have been, grafters, putting in the hours, publishing really good content for many years, allowing them to sort of step out from behind the keyboard a little bit and build a more trusting and open and informal and passionate and the kind of conversation you have in the pub, right? And I don't think those two things need to be in opposition. I think you can have your authoritative, declarative news journalism, and you can have podcasts sitting alongside that are a little more nuanced and fun. Let's see if we can carry that off. And then the last thing, just before we go on, the last thing was just make money, right? You got to make money. That's there in the strategy. We need podcasts to be not just fluffy little marketing vehicles for our brands, but actually things that are self-sustaining at least, and then that are actually putting a good chunk of change into the bottom line.
So out of that portfolio, are there any of the podcasts which have raised particular challenges? I'm sure there have been challenges with all of them, but are there any that you can mention, and why has that been the case?
Well, I'll come on to one in a sec, but what I will say as well is that the podcasts that have given me the most challenges have not seen the light of day. We've, if it's been things that have, for whatever reason, and there have been several reasons, and I can sort of touch on them in the abstract, for whatever reason these podcasts haven't worked, we just haven't launched them. And I think that's a good and valuable thing to do. It's the old, it's say no to stuff more than you say yes to stuff thing. So we've seen issues with, sometimes it has been too much of a handbrake turn for some people within the organization to switch to this way of storytelling. And we have had issues with, buy-in and political will, if you like, for doing stuff. We've had difficulty with, jostling for priorities in an ever-shifting media environment. So, depending on this stage that a brand is at in its journey, it may be that they are looking with great relish at adding new media channels to allow them to engage with people in different ways. If they're at a different part in their journey, they might be looking more at consolidating a position or hunkering down on a particular strategy. So we've definitely had those kind of challenges. But to answer your question a bit more, a bit less abstractly and a bit less obliquely, I think The Dirt has been our most difficult podcast to get off the ground. Now, The Dirt is a gardening and allotment podcast that is associated to Grow Your Own magazine. It is now in its third season, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a sec. But it is a very complex thing, and so the challenge is not so much. I mean, if you listen to it, I hope and pray if you listen to it, it would sound fairly effortless, because we've done a lot of work to make sure that that is the case. But behind the scenes, it is a very complex edit. We have guests on every show, which adds its own logistical overhead. We've done a lot of high-profile partnerships. So in this season, for example, we're partnering with the National Trust, which is great and exciting, but again, brings its own challenges. There's lots of editing needed, especially now we're all recording over the net using a system like Zencastr or Squadcast or Cast or any number of these systems that will allow you to have, independent audio from each of the participants. But that brings in a lot of editing. And the more raucous and informal the conversation is, with crosstalk and two people talking at once and then one person goes or whatever, the more that needs to be edited. And also, the team's based in Colchester and I'm here in Dundee. Now, in the before times, I did go down a few times to do some producing work, work as a producer with them to, make them think about the way to tell these stories and give them some confidence and get them used to the kit and all that sort of stuff. But it is all completely done remote, even before we switched over to recording over the web. But given all that, it is our biggest show. And it's the one that makes me consistently incredibly happy because it is warm and sweet and charming and a brilliant adjunct to the main brand. So the main brand, the magazine's about, how to grow the best tomatoes or whatever. Whereas The Dirt is about gardening failures. And it's about celebrating the fact that, things, I was going to say don't always go right, but things never go right in the allotment or in the garden when you're growing fruit or veg. Now, you'll know that, Ciar. I know you're a keen gardener. But
indeed.
but the sheer kind of warmth of that show makes it all completely worth it.
So when you are doing the dishes or some other mundane activity, what podcasts do you listen to and admire outside of your own portfolio?
Well, that's an interesting question. In part because it's one of the greatest sadnesses of the pandemic for me is that my main podcast listening opportunity was on my 8 mile a day commute on the bike, and I don't have that anymore. Now you can easily argue, Chris, you can still go out and cycle, mate. It's fine, just go and cycle. But without that kind of obligatory 20 minutes each way each day, I've kind of lost a huge portion of the chunk of time that I would sit listen to podcasts. And when you're sitting in Audition all day, as I tend to do, editing stuff, it's not the case that I don't want to listen to podcasts at the end of that. I really, really do. But it's that I like, you might find this as well, Ciar, but one of the greatest sadnesses of being a podcast guy is that I can't listen to music while I work anymore. I can't just sit and put a nice album on or something, or stick a Spotify playlist on, because I need to be listening to the thing I'm editing. And so the opportunities to listen to stuff are squeezed out of my day, which is a real pain, because there are tons and tons of podcasts I really enjoy. Now, I, in common with respect, a lot of people started off my podcast journey listening to podcasts that were essentially radio shows repackaged and republished as podcasts. The BBC here in the UK, I've spoken to a lot of people in the US who do a similar thing with NPR. But now it's a smorgasbord. So I am ready for this question. I was ready for this question because it's a question people always ask me. So let me give you 5 podcasts that I listen to currently. Don't ever call these my favorite podcasts because it changes all the time. But these are 5 that I adore just now. Top of the list is 20,000 Hertz. Now, 20,000 Hertz is a podcast about sound, all different aspects of sound. But the thing that I adore about 20,000 Hertz is it is produced by a sound design studio, and the production values are off the chart. It is an absolute just my producer senses tingle every time I listen to it. I couldn't do this. There's no way I could produce work of this quality yet in my podcasting and producing career. I'll get there, but I can't do it yet. And it is just so joyous to listen to an organization producing something of such incomparable, apparently effortless quality. And it's also just completely fascinating. So I adore that. Next on the list, Fortunately, which is a BBC podcast with Fee Glover and Jane Garvey. It's a very dangerous podcast to recommend to people because it's a sort of podcast that everyone thinks they can do because it's just two people sitting down having a chat. They bring a guest in as well every episode, but the charm of it is just in Fee and Jane having a chat. And it's a dangerous one to recommend because everybody thinks they can do that. And unless you are both fascinating and charming and also have had 20, 30 years of radio experience under your belt, you can't do that, I submit.
Yeah.
It takes a huge amount of discipline to be able to do that really, really well. Off Menu is another favorite. Now, it's a huge podcast. A lot of people listening to this will know and love Off Menu. It is a comedy podcast. Well, it's not a comedy podcast. It's a funny podcast from James Acaster. And oh God, I've forgotten the other chap's name. Anyway, those two. Ed Gamble, there it is. Finally came into my head, and it is. It's a really good. It's a good podcast to recommend because it's a podcast based on a structure. And there's a really simple rubric, and it is they get a guest in and they ask him his favorite main course, so starter, main course, drink, dessert, and side dish. And they just, but it's a really simple structure around which just anarchy happens, of course, as you'd expect. And they tend to be interviewing other comedians in this dream restaurant. So it's a really good example. It's like, I'm really torn with these because part of me is just like, these are the podcasts I love. And part of me is like, I know people will be listening to me talking and thinking, okay, but what can we do that is that? What were the lessons that we can apply to our business? And I think with Off Menu, it's that really simple message of, come up with a structure and then riff on that. So that's brilliant. On a purely personal level, I adore Lingthusiasm. It's a podcast that's enthusiastic about language. It is quite a nerdy podcast about etymologies and the structure of language and phonemes and a whole bunch of stuff. I'm not academically interested, or I don't have an academic background in this, but I find it really, really fascinating. And it's a really good example of a podcast that, started with two friends, two professional linguists who recorded this thing and put it out. It started off very ropey quality, but it's got much, much better. It has accreted a whole bunch of different brand extensions as part of that. So they've got merch, they do live shows, they have a Patreon where people can directly support them. There's no advertising on it. And again, incredibly niche, but they really lean into the nicheness of it and they build a utterly compelling show because of it. And it's just perfectly pitched. Very occasionally they stray, I think, a little too much into academia, but they always pull it back and make it broadly applicable to anybody outside of their particular specialism. So that's great. And then finally, the one that I always recommend as one of my favorites is The Week Unwrapped. Now, most people working in publishing will know The Week. It is a phenomenon. It is a hugely successful thing. And it's also a brilliant magazine. And if you don't know it, go out and get it. It's a really good example of how you can do publishing really well, in which they digest basically the week's news from a whole bunch of media outlets into a single weekly magazine, small format magazine. The Week Unwrapped is a really brilliant adjunct to that for a bunch of reasons. One, it's just incredibly listenable to, really fascinating, very, very charming, and it's a really good way to think about stuff that's happening in the world without thinking about. It's not, and this is the genius of it. It's about the stories that have passed under the radar. So it's not about the US election. It's not about Brexit. It's not about coronavirus. But it is about things that are happening in the world that do have repercussions for everybody. And it's a brilliant example of how you can produce something that is a partner to and an extension of and an enrichment of your main brand without replicating that brand. It doesn't seek to replicate what The Week does, but it takes an element of it that works really well and it runs with it. And it's a joy. So that's one that I'm always really happy to see pop up on my phone.
Well, there's some great suggestions there. Thank you. I'm going to go away and listen to some of those that I don't know.
Come back and tell me what you think of them.
Yes,
I really want to hear.
Yeah. So In March this year at the Publisher Podcast Awards, you were named Publisher Podcast Hero of the Year 2020, which is quite an accolade. And the judges said they were looking for someone who is eager to make the technology and production processes beneficial to a publisher's workflow and who is a true inspiration to anyone looking to launch their first or their next podcast. And drawing from that, firstly, I'd like to ask, what would you say are the main podcast production challenges facing publishers today?
Well, that's really easy. It's just the fact that we're all remote just now. Everybody's recording over the net for one reason or another. Now that brings some advantages, and all the teams I've worked with have suddenly gone, "Oh, it's actually really, it's no harder to bring a guest in than it is to record with everyone." Because whereas before it might be, we're all going to get around this table. How do we bring a guest in? Do we get them to come here? Do we get them to phone in? How do we record that phone call? All this sort of stuff. Whereas now everybody's on the same playing field. So that definitely brings some advantages. And from a pure production process standpoint as well, it brings some advantages. The system that you and I are recording on today is the one that we use as well. And like others like it produces an individual sound file for me and an individual sound file for you. So you can drop those into your audio workstation. You've got completely isolated audio so that if I've been quite good, I'm a good boy, I've got everything shut off and everything's, doors are closed and my daughter's at school and I don't have a dog. But if there was any of that sort of noises off happening, you could easily delete that out in the edit. Or if, if I'm in mid-flow and you think you're going to interrupt me and then you change your mind, you can easily edit out your, I was just going to, because, it's easy to do that. So there are some advantages to it, but it is those advantages do not outweigh the massive pain it is to deal with the recording over the net. Part of it is just ensuring audio quality for one thing, and we're lucky that we've got about 30 odd mics now with each individual podcast. We're standardizing a particular microphone that gives really good results wherever you are, and they just plug straight into your laptop, so that helps. But even if we're working with external guests, we've got to onboard them and deal with all their stuff now. This is something you're very familiar with as well, Ciar, doing this podcast. But even allowing for all that, the biggest challenge is once you get everything into your audio workstation, there are delays on the internet, and those delays create little gaps between somebody asking a question and somebody answering it. They create gaps between somebody making a joke and somebody laughing, which often makes the laughter sound quite sarcastic. And as I said before, if two people start talking at once, you've got to sort of untangle that, and that's all totally fine. And I pride myself in the fact that across our 10 podcasts, I would submit they sound better than a lot of podcasts do that were recorded with everybody sitting around a table all at once on high quality equipment. But it's at a cost, and that cost is time and also my hairline to try to polish these things up. Now, if it's just, question, answer, it's generally okay. But the more conversational and informal it is, and the longer it is, the more that work piles up, and it's a significant challenge.
Well, as you say, we launched the In Publishing podcast in the middle of the first lockdown, so those challenges sound very familiar.
Yes.
And my next question, still touching on your award and the fact that you were cited as an inspiration to anyone looking to launch their first or next podcast. What would your advice be for publishers thinking of launching a new podcast?
Well, you need to plan and you need to test. So, plan, not when I say plan, I don't just mean, do your launch plan and your marketing plan and everything else. But that, you need to do that as well for sure. But give some thought to format and innovation around format. Not every podcast has to be just a bunch of people sitting around talking about stuff. You can innovate around that. An example I often quote there is a podcast called For a Bad Time Call. And that's a podcast entirely predicated on the fact that there was a voicemail number set up and women could phone up and just rant about stuff for 2 minutes. And it was about, inequalities of gender in the workplace and in life and everything else. And they could just phone up and rant about it. And then they would just sort of stitch these together and put it out as a podcast. Now, that's, in format terms, quite innovative, very innovative. But think about how that could apply to your brand, even literally that, right? If you are, Grazia, or you are, a stylist, or you are even something like in publishing.
Yeah.
People anonymously ranting and do have a vocal changer on them, anonymously ranting about their job or the industry they're in or something. That's quite interesting. Please don't do that.
It sounds like a minefield.
The libel suits come out of that. Anyway, but think about those format choices, but then test it. Record some pilots that never see the light of day. Assure people they will never see the light of day. Actually, on that, the podcast that we are going to launch next, we did that pilot of, and we are going to launch it because there was a thing that happened in it that was just exceptional, and we have to share it. But we're going to keep it until like 4 or 5 episodes in, because it was recorded on like people's laptops, and it sounds crap, but the content is still good enough. But we're going to let that podcast bed in a little bit with some good quality, and then do a sort of like, and we recorded this pilot, and we weren't going to share it with you, but just listen and you'll see why. But you've got to do that pilot thing, and then let key stakeholders within the organization listen to it and see what they think of it, and just try and listen to it while you're doing the dishes, or you're walking the dog, or you're commuting or something, in the way that people would actually listen to it. Don't sit there and stare at it intently, stare at the playhead on your phone intently as you listen to it. Do it as you would listen to it. So that's one thing. Plan and test, definitely. You need to set some expectations internally about what these will be. For all I Adore podcasts, and for all we're still experiencing sort of growth of sort of 17% month on month across our portfolio every single month. The numbers are still comparatively small, and you need to understand where the value is in those numbers. It's a highly engaged. They spend multiple hours a month with podcasts, whereas they might only spend a couple of minutes transactionally on a website, all that sort of stuff. But you need to make sure that your internal stakeholders, whether that's people who sign things off, or whether it's just the team themselves, make them understand what that might, they might not be super excited with the numbers internally. But that brings me to my last point, which is do it and keep doing it. Do it because the risks and costs are comparatively small. It's nothing like the old pivot to video. You can do this very, very cheaply, very quickly, very low touch. And so you should think about how you can, but you should. And then keep doing it is the really key thing as well. Most podcasts, when they launch, they have a little spike of interest, and then it sort of goes down, and then it sort of bubbles away for a long time doing basically nothing. And then eventually that trend line starts to trend up and up and up. And eventually you start to see some really exciting numbers out of this. And that comes from just ambiently advertising it and marketing it, but it also comes from just keeping doing it. Trust yourselves. You're launching an entirely new thing, but trust yourselves. You're professionals. You know how this works. You know what good editorial storytelling is. Trust yourselves that you're building something good. If you're not, if you suddenly go, I think we're doing a bit crap here, then go back and change it. But trust that you can do something good. Do it and keep doing it.
It's been reported that most podcasts fail 7 episodes in.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
That's definitely true. Well, I would say that's true, or at least it is an oft reported stat from people who do kind of meta-analysis on the podcast market. I think we don't have to necessarily worry about that as professional publishers, really, because that, I suspect that number is being highly skewed by the fact that most podcasts, as I say, there's over 1 million out there, most of them get a few dozen downloads an episode, because mostly they're hobbyists, and it's people in bedrooms, and they're marketing to their mates, and that's pretty much as far as they go. And then they just get disheartened, or they life changes and their priorities change, and they have to go off and do something else. Now, I will be at pains to say I do not think that podcasters who sit in their bedrooms making podcasts about whatever it is they care about are deluded or bad people. Those are incredibly valuable podcasts, and it makes me sad that so many of them do stop after 7 episodes. Just because you're not getting tens of thousands of downloads per episode doesn't mean to say you're not producing something of value for the people who do listen to it. But I think that's kind of where that number comes from, that 7 episode pod fade, it's called. That pod fade comes from 7 episodes in, because they get a bit disheartened, they change. The only other thing I'll add to that, though, is about deliverability. This is something that I bang the drum on a lot, and I was, you've referenced the award I got this year, which was intensely. I was so pleased to get it. We didn't know that award existed, and I was humbled and delighted to get it. But one of the things they particularly highlighted was about workflow. And it's something I've been banging on about a lot, because we need to make these projects deliverable, because if they're not, you won't keep doing them. They need to be easy to produce. And I remember in my days as an editor-in-chief, if I wanted to do something like this, not necessarily a podcast, but anything outside the regular beat of the magazine or the websites that I was in charge of, I'd have to invent it all myself. I'd have to invent the wheel myself. And I was really keen at DC Thomson Media that if we were going to do podcasts, I would be able to say to editorial teams, walk into a room with a few jotted down notes, I'll press record, and then you have to walk out of that room afterwards, and everything else will be done for you. Because otherwise, the barrier to the friction involved in putting those things out could be too great. Now, not just that, but ensuring the format is something that can be, delivered time and time again without too much hassle. And some of our podcasts are that classic, just, people sit down, they chat for half an hour, and they stand up and walk out again. Some of them are more structured. Energy Voice Out Loud, for example, is a 3-segment show. It's a 3-handed show with 3 of the editorial, or changing cast of the 3 team members, and they come on, and each one brings a news story, delivers it, and then they have chat about it, and then they move on. But even stuff like that can really, really help. And I think having that focus on deliverability from a technical point of view, with templates and pre-built fades on music and everything else, but also from an editorial point of view, is really key. So I think if you want to avoid pod fade, set your expectations on numbers, but then also ensure that you're giving yourself the best possible chance of delivering the podcast that you want to put out.
Now, you've talked about your own strategy, but when it comes to publishers in general, where do podcasts typically sit as part of their commercial strategy?
Well, it's very nascent at the moment, isn't it? It's still we're still very much figuring this out. Everyone is. The States is a good bit ahead of us in the UK on that, and we should try to close that gap as quickly as possible. But it's still quite nascent from a publisher point of view. There are some people doing some really good innovative things. Look at The Economist, for example, which uses its podcast. In fact, the Week Unwrapped one I recommended, which uses its podcast very strongly as an onboarding vehicle into the parent reification of the brand. So, offers for subscribers and that sort of stuff. Commercially, it's a bit more challenging. There are two. Commercially, it's a bit more challenging because the numbers are so small, and especially in this country, the advertisers are so ill-educated about the benefits of advertising on podcasts. And so that's a big challenge for commercial teams to work out how to have that as part of their storytelling. For us, certainly, just now, the main strategy is to sell sponsorships, and to do that as part of a broader commercial package with key clients. So nothing particularly innovative from a structural point of view, but being able to bring the podcast into that commercial offering is valuable for our commercial teams, because apart from anything else, it gives them something interesting and novel to talk about, but it also demonstrates that, unlike a lot of publishers, we're not just circling the wagons and managing decline. We are investing and innovating and driving our editorial and our commercial strategies forward.
So my next question was about making money, but you've really probably covered that. I mean, the two main ways are, firstly, onboarding people to your brand, and secondly, sponsorship.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And I think with sponsorship in particular, that's certainly for most publishers, I would suggest of moderate size, that's going to be the key benefit there, because of course you can it's in some ways a very, very old-fashioned and classic way of selling advertising, right? Because it's not programmatic, it's not audience segmentation, or rather it's not programmatic audience segmentation. It's just if you are Sutton's organic seed catalog, you know that if you advertise on the Dirt, that was our launch partner for the Dirt, if you advertise on the Dirt, you're going to be reaching an audience that is relevant to you. And that's it's the old thing with specialist publishers, that they can attract a niche audience, And that niche audience is then important to advertisers because there's no wasted dollars there. It's different to putting an ad in the independent, where you might have a cut through rate of single digit percentages, whereas for us, being able to promote into these podcasts is really key. There are two other things I'll throw into the mix. One is events, and it's not one we've done all that much with yet, but it's definitely on our radar to do. If you look at the classic My Dad Wrote a Porno podcast, which I highly recommend. It is exceptionally not safe for work, but I highly recommend it. That started off again, just a couple of people, 3 people around a kitchen table recording the podcast, and then they sold out the Albert Hall. They do events, they do live events. Look at Guilty Feminist podcast, they do live events and screenings and stuff all the time. So you can sell tickets to recordings of your podcast, or in other ways reach out there, or bring it in as part of a broader event strategy that you have. That's definitely one thing. And then the last one is dynamic ads, which is I think what actually most people reach for from the get-go with podcasting, which is quite a sloppy way of thinking. I think it's just, it's the old, let's build an editorial product and then we'll just put some ads in and that'll be what make money, right? And so with dynamic ads, then you upload your podcast, you tell your podcast host at this timestamp and this timestamp you may put in ads, and then you do a little bit of audience matching and the ads are put in dynamically for you. The challenge for that, and the reason that we're not we're not doing it, and I'm laughing at myself when I do that, because we are still a reasonably small player in this space, but the reason even we're not doing that is you need to have a phenomenal scale for that to be making money. The CPM for that will be somewhere in the region of between maybe £4 and £10 if you're very lucky. And so you need to be generating tens of thousands of downloads, hundreds of thousands of downloads in order for it to be generating any kind of significant revenue into your bottom line. And I would submit that actually the chance to piss off your audience with advertising at that scale will actually retard your growth early doors than it would be later on. It's important for us to have commercial partners for stuff, but we'd rather handpick those partners than just to open up to an ad exchange like Dax or Acast and then just have stuff chucked on there. But I also am quite definitive when I say things like that, but I'm constantly thinking about it and worrying about it and trying to think whether we made the right call. I mean, there are some advantages to, for example, allowing those ads into your podcast, even just from an optics point of view, because, if you're getting adverts for small local companies, even though those might be a better relevant fit, and even actually if they're generating more revenue for you than a dynamic ad serving partner would be, balance that against the fact that if you use a dynamic ad serving partner, you might get ads for Audi and Jaguar and Breitling or whoever. I think there's probably a little bit over excited, but you'll get ads for large national and supranational brands in there. So there might be an argument just from an optics point of view for doing something like that. Anyway, I'm still thinking.
Now, I know you can't tell us about this new podcast that you've got coming up, but is there anything you can let us in on about developments on the horizon for podcasting at DC Thomson?
Yes, so we're definitely ramping up those partnerships that I talked about. As I say, Seriously of the Dirt, episode 1 of which just came out last week as we record this, is in partnership with the National Trust, and things like that are really important for us as a way of deepening our audience reach, right? So the National Trust has 900,000 followers on Twitter, so when they tweet about us on there, that really helps us. So those kind of partnerships are an important part of our strategy going forward. We're also really ramping up the Stushy, which is our politics podcast, with a kind of Scottish slant. And part of the reason we're putting so much effort into that as a brand, and now that's a really interesting example actually, because that's a brand that sits across our newspaper portfolio. So we have it sits across the Courier, the Press and Journal, which are the number 2 and 1 regional papers in the UK respectively. So they sit across those, as well as the Evening Telegraph, the Evening Express and the Sunday Post. So that's a interesting experiment for a publishing company like ours as a way of using its existing brands in interesting ways. So we're ramping that up ahead of the likely Hollywood elections in spring of next year. And again, part of that is explicitly about bringing, making our journalists be more than a byline on a page or on a screen, and allowing that as we reach towards those elections for the Scottish Parliament, that we are positioned as the voice of journalism in Scotland ahead of those elections. So things like that are really important for us. Just a ton of stuff. That new launch I'm talking about is really cool. I'm in the middle. Oh man, I really wish I could tell you about it, but we're in the middle of recording the theme tune for it. And I say recording the theme tune for it. So normally we would use a stock library,
right,
like Shutterstock or Getty or any one of the big libraries that have got music in their library would normally use that. But in this case, we've discovered there's a piece of music which is appropriate, let's say, and we want to get that recorded. So we're in the middle of trying to work out how we can do that in the teeth of the pandemic. But there's just so much fun stuff coming up. I'm super excited.
Well, it sounds like you've got a lot of good stuff coming. What do you see as the main trends in podcasting more generally going forward?
Some of them are good. Some of them give me pause. Siloization is a big one as big companies try to come in and extract direct revenue from podcasting. We're seeing, podcasts become exclusive to Spotify, for example, as Spotify invests hundreds of millions into podcasting. We see things like Luminary starting up as a kind of Netflix for podcasting. And I kind of worry a little bit that I'm enough of an old hippie to really like the idea of the open web, and podcasting is based on a incredibly open format. It's RSS, which is an XML based format, and that brings some pains, but some advantages as well. But yeah, siloization is a big one. Monetization is obviously huge as part of that. Just generally making more money out of this stuff. Accountability is really key in terms of being able to report numbers back to advertising partners. All of that's kind of the business side of things, but one thing I'll pick out as a broader meta trend here is just the surfacing of underrepresented voices. It's one of the key things that podcasting can do, and it's one of the things that makes me most excited to be working in this medium. Is it can easily onboard underrepresented voices, whether that's in gender, race, or sexuality, whatever it happens to be, and give them a platform. That is, it's the democratization of publishing. Same thing we've been seeing since ever the internet was invented. But that's a really key thing, and I think we'll see a much greater plurality of voices and perspectives as part of the national conversation going forward, and that can only be a good
thing. Brilliant. Well, finally, outside of work, what do you do to relax?
Outside of work, what a concept. I have a 5-year-old daughter, so we do a lot of stomping through woodlands, that sort of stuff. I mentioned I really enjoy cycling. I don't get a chance to do it very much. I'm a big advocate of e-bikes, electric bikes, as a way of getting around town and doing chores as well as doing leisure stuff. Telly, I love to consume telly. I remember identifying years and years ago that the more intense my media production goes in the daytime, the more I want to not produce anything in the evening. And so while there's a part of me that really wants to start doing some ceramics, and there's a part of me, I went to art school, there's a part of me wants to get back into doing some drawing. There's definitely a part of me that just goes, once my daughter's asleep, there will be gin and there will be The Good Life. The Good Place, sorry, and The Good Life. That's another great show.
Yeah, let's go back into that.
And there will just be sitting on the settee and consuming the brilliant stuff that other people have made.
Yeah, I hear where you're coming from. Brilliant. Well, Chris, thank you so much for being our guest on the In Publishing podcast.
My pleasure.
A big thank you again to Acorn Web Offset for sponsoring this podcast. If you're looking for a new magazine printer, then check out their website at acornweb.co.uk or contact Matt Carey on 07714 299 105 or by email at matthew.carey@acornweb.co.uk. Thanks, Chris, for being our guest this week. I, for one, can definitely learn from his insights into how to make great podcasts. You can find out more about DC Thomson Media at dctmedia.co.uk, and you can follow Chris on Twitter at Chris Phin. If you would like to get in touch with us, then our email address is editorial@inpublishing.co.uk. Thank you for listening, and please join me next week on the In Publishing podcast.